last on which you're falling. All Caroline wants up to hear was a good cheer from everywhere, feeling there.
Вітаємо вас на українській телемережі «Контакт». Я Марта Czurylowicz і я дуже рада, що маю нагоду провести з вами наступну годину. Ми всі дуже переживаємо про корупцію в Україні, але мало хто знає, що в нашого північного сусіда справа значно гірша. Наша кореспондентка Вікторія Машошина представить виступ у Торонті Вільяма Бродера, голови фонду Hermitage Capital Management, на тему «Russia – a failing mafia state». Тут не лише корупція, тут холоднокровне вбивство. Сьогодні в передачі «Очима культури» доктор Марко Роберстех розповість про славетного актора і кінорежисера Івана Миколайчука. Наша наймолодша кореспондентка Олександра Голик представить чарівний, але вибагливий світ балету. А Рон Кагут завітає до Інституту Святого Володимира, де пан Сидоренко оповідає про елегантний світ українського вальсу. Рівно ж сьогодні повертаємось до серії технічних порад, у якій Микола Гута при відділі інформаційної технології міжнародної фірми McCain Foods розкриє нам цікавий світ інтернетного зв'язку.
Щедрик, щедрівочка, прилетіла ластівочка, стало собі щебетати, господаря кликати.
Ми всі дуже переживаємо про корупцію в Україні, але мало хто знає, що в нашого північного сусіда справа значно гірша. Наша кореспондентка Вікторія Машошина представить виступ у Торонті Вільяма Бродера, голови фонду Hermitage Capital Management, на тему «Russia – a failing mafia state». Тут не лише корупція, тут холоднокровне вбивство.
Трагічна загибель російського адвоката Сергія Магнитського у 2009 році в російському СІЗО «Матроська тишина» шокувала увесь світ. Тогочасний голова фонду Hermitage Capital Management Вільям Бродер розповість нам, що відбувалося насправді і які санкції були встановлені Європарламентом та Конгресом США до чиновників, причетних до справи вбивства Сергія Магнитського.
The relationship between East and West is changing. The West is taking notice of what is going on in Putin's Russia right now. On Thursday, as you'll hear, the Senate approved by a pretty big majority, 92-4, in fact, to place visa bans and asset freezes on corrupt Russian officials who were involved in the death of Sergei Magnitsky.
It was all very exciting and profitable and heady. Going from nothing to becoming this enormous investor. But I discovered when I was investing in these companies that the companies in Russia were basically non-profit companies. Basically all the profits were being stolen by the guys who ran these companies. And there seemed to be nothing in Russia stopping them. There was no police stopping them, the regulators weren't stopping them, the politicians weren't stopping them. It was just a wild frenzy of unstoppable corruption. And so I decided to try to do something to stop it. And so I had the perfect life and the perfect job for about 4 years, from 1999 to 2003. I was able to make money and do good in the same job. And that all worked perfectly until 2003. And in October of 2003, Putin arrested the richest man in Russia, Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. And they put him on trial for tax evasion. And as you probably all know at this point, in Russia, there's no presumption of innocence in any type of criminal affair. I'm sure they had a hard time figuring out what to do with me. I arrived in Sheremetyevo on this particular trip. Instead of letting me into the country, they kept me waiting in the lounge for about an hour and a half. And then a bunch of armed guards came into the lounge and frog-marched me down to the detention center of the airport, locked me up overnight, and then deported me the next day and declared me a threat to national security a couple weeks later, never to return to Russia. I had no idea that that wasn't the end of that story, but the beginning of the worst nightmare that anyone could ever experience anywhere, truly. 18 months after I was expelled, 25 officers from the Interior Ministry of Moscow raided my office. 25 more officers raided the office of an American law firm that I used called Firestone Duncan. And they were specifically looking for the stamps, seals, the certificates of our investment holding companies through which we had invested our money in Russia. I was shocked, and so was everyone else around me. And so we went and hired a bunch of lawyers to help us try to figure out this whole mess. And one of the lawyers was a young man, a 36-year-old lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei worked for the American law firm Firestone Duncan, and he was the smartest lawyer I knew in Moscow. And I asked Sergei to investigate and figure out what this whole story was all about. And he came back a couple weeks later and he said, "This doesn't look good, Bill." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, in addition to stealing your companies, the documents that were seized by the police were used to create $1 billion of forged, backdated contracts to claim that our companies owed $1 billion to 3 empty shell companies." I said, "That's terrible." He said, "It gets much worse." He said, "Those shell companies then sued your companies in court for $1 billion. You didn't know about it, obviously, because you didn't own your companies anymore. But 3 lawyers who you didn't hire showed up to represent your companies in court. And those 3 lawyers, instead of vigorously fighting against $1 billion of fake claims, pled guilty immediately to $1 billion. And the judge, there's 3 judges, stamped the claims and said, no need to prove anything at this point. After that, the police, the same police officer who led the raids on our office, raided all of our banks with search warrants looking for $1 billion of assets. Thankfully, there were no assets there. They couldn't get our assets. And when I understood that they couldn't get our assets, I started to relax. I thought, okay, this is good. Sergei, my lawyer, said, "Bill, these Russian stories don't ever end this way. There's more to the story. There's never a happy ending to these Russian stories." And what he discovered was that when we had left Russia and taken all of our money out, we had to declare a profit of $1 billion to the tax authorities. And on the $1 billion of profits, we paid $230 million of taxes. Instead of opening criminal cases against the bad guys, the Russian law enforcement agencies opened up criminal cases against all 7 of our lawyers from 4 different law firms. I didn't expect that. I thought maybe I was at risk. I thought maybe my employees were at risk, my property, but not my lawyers. I didn't expect that. The 6 of the 7 lawyers who worked for me left. The one who didn't was Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei was an idealist. He was just young enough to not have been conscious during the Soviet times, and he was brought up during this period of hope and optimism that Russia was a normal country. And when I asked Sergei to leave, he said, "I've not broken any laws, and I know the law, and the law will protect me." And 1 month later, 2 subordinates of one of the officers that he testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning in front of his wife and 2 children and arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, and then began to start to torture him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in a cell with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to sleep deprive him. And they presented him then with a false confession saying that he stole the $230 million, asking him to sign it. They put him in a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They would regularly forget to feed him for 36 hours. They took away his water boiling device, so he had to drink the bacteria-infested water of Russian prison. And they didn't know Sergei Magnitsky. I don't think Sergei Magnitsky even knew how strong he was until he was confronted with this unbelievable torment. And the harder they pushed on him, the stronger he got. And he just refused to sign this false confession. In the process of all this torture, he started getting severe pains in his stomach. He lost 40 pounds, and he was eventually diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation. The operation was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. 1 week before the scheduled operation, they came to him and abruptly moved him from Matroshka Tishina prison to Butyrka prison. Butyrka is a maximum security prison, one of the toughest in Russia, and most significantly for Sergei, They have no medical facilities there. And he went into critical condition.
In one famous case, Sergei Magnitsky died in prison trying to protect hundreds of millions of dollars from being stolen from the budget.
Sergei was a lawyer, a husband, and a father. He exposed a group of Russian officials and organized criminals stealing from the Russian people.
I've got two objectives with the Magnitsky campaign. One is to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and the second is to make sure that his death wasn't a meaningless death, and that comes to his legacy. And so from his legacy standpoint, I'd be most proud to have his name associated with a global bill that stopped terrible things happening anywhere in the world. In advance of a trip that we have planned to Ottawa tomorrow to present to the Canadian government the idea of implementing Magnitsky sanctions here in Canada. This follows on the footsteps of the U.S. Senate approving the Magnitsky law last week, and this follows also on some initiatives that we did earlier, a year and a half ago, with members of the Canadian Parliament in pushing forward the Magnitsky bill. The idea is to impose visa sanctions and asset freezes on the Russian officials who killed Sergei Magnitsky and those who perpetuate other human rights abuses. And it seems to be a policy that truly touches the human rights abusers, and is a policy that's basically free for Canada. It doesn't cost anything to implement. It's politically the most acceptable thing you can have. To ban tortures and murders from coming into Canada, nobody would object. And it's sort of the new technology of fighting human rights abuse.